Hello, I'm Brian Tracy, and welcome to this show on selling. You know, I started my sales career when I was 10 years old knocking on doors. And the first thing I found is when I knocked on doors and I offered my little products, I was selling soap to work my way to YMCA camp. First thing people would say is, I'm sorry, we can't afford it. We don't want it, don't need it. We don't use it in our house. I have to check it with someone else. We have enough. That's not our favorite brand. We have special needs and requirements. We're fully stocked for now. Could you call me back in a week, a month, a year, and so on? And I would say, okay, thank you very much. And I'd go on to the next house. And I'd go on to the next house, and I'd go on to the next house. And you know what I found? Is they all seem to say the same things. Now, I learned a valuable lesson here. And this is where we'll start off this session on overcoming objections, is that there are no sales without objections. And that I used to be crushed when I got an objection, like you're crushed when you get an objection. I used to think, oh my, I've wasted my time. I've gotten in front of a prospect, and now I'm getting these reasons why they cannot or will not buy. And then I learned this great truth. And it is this, is that first of all, there aren't any sales without objections, but second of all, objections indicate interest. Objections indicate interest. In other words, when the prospect begins to object, it means that they're interested. Imagine you're with a prospect and you're talking about your product and they say, or you're asking them questions and they're not giving you any answers. Is this a good prospect? No, but when a prospect is saying, well, what about this and what about that and how do I know this and how do I know that and how come I can get it cheaper somewhere else and I don't really think we're in the market. These are very, very good because they mean this. It means when a prospect starts to object, it means that you've touched an emotional nerve. Is you're touching something inside them that is very close to a need they have, a problem, a desire, something, and you're touching the nerve, and the objections are the nerve jumping. Successful sales, as we know, successful sales have twice as many objections as non-successful sales. So therefore, from now on, when you're giving a presentation and the prospect starts to object, you should say inside yourself, thank heavens that he or she is objecting. Because if they're not objecting, it means it's like a hook. It's like a fish grabbing the hook. If you're sitting there fishing and there's no tug on your line, you're out of luck. But if you're sitting there fishing and you start to feel a tug and more tugs, it means that you've got a chance of catching something. And when the customer starts to object, it means that the game is on and you have an opportunity to move forward, answer the question satisfactorily, and to make a sale. Now this brings us to one of the most important parts of selling, which I learned many years ago, and I call it the Law of Six. The Law of Six says that the number of possible objections in any prospect or product or service offering is limited to probably 6. Now you may get hundreds of objections over the course of a week, a month, a year, but the number of actual objections is limited to 6. The number is limited. Your job is to identify what those 6 objections are. So the way that you do it, number 2, is you determine and define your top 6. I had someone come up to me in a sales seminar recently and said, what are the 6? And I said, what do you mean, what are the 6? I'll tell you, every single product or service selling in every market against every competitor under all competitive conditions has 6, and very often they'll be different. In fact, you could be selling a similar product to someone else's, and your 6 or some of your 6 will be different from others. So here is an exercise that you use. It's called a sentence completion exercise, and it's one of the most important exercises in creative thinking ever done. You sit down by yourself, or better yet, you sit down with the other salespeople in your company, you take an hour or two aside, and you say this question: we could sell all we wanted to if our customers just didn't say ... Finish the sentence. You get that? In other words, we could sell all we wanted if our customers didn't object by saying, what do they say? And write down everything. We could sell all we want if our customers didn't say, can't afford it. We could sell all we wanted if our customers didn't say they're not in the market. We could sell all we want if our customers didn't say that they're happy with our competitors, and so on. Write down all your objectives. Use this sentence completion exercise. And then number 3 is develop bulletproof answers. Now, a bulletproof answer is an answer that if you are dealing with an actual qualified prospect, I'm not talking about somebody who's going bankrupt or somebody who's being fired, you're talking about to a prospect A bulletproof answer is when they bring up this objection, you have exactly the answer that destroys the objection. It's like pulling a .357 Magnum out and taking the objection and going boom, boom, and killing the objection dead. So here's your fourth question. The fourth part of this is ask this: why don't your customers buy? Why don't they buy? You should know this, and you should be constantly thinking, why don't they buy? Because imagine you're sitting at a stop sign. There are two ways that you can go ahead faster. One is if you have your foot on the gas, you can take your foot off the brake, and the other is you can just simply step on the gas. If you can take your foot off the brake, if you can identify the reasons why they don't buy, if you can neutralize those reasons, very often you can make more progress in your sales field in a short while than ever before. Many companies have transformed their entire sales by the very act of identifying their major objection and then eliminating that objection. So here's the key question: when do you deal with objections? Well, there's 4 different times to deal with objections depending upon what the objections are. When is the key question, and I'll tell you how in just a second. First is immediately. Now, there are only some objections that you deal with immediately, and those are the objections that refer to your integrity or your reputation or the quality of your company. If a person says, I understand your products are lousy quality, you can't say, well, can I come back to that later? If a person says, I understand your company's been shut down by the sheriff, you can't say, well, could we talk about that later? These are the things that you deal with up front right as soon as they come up, and you point out quickly and carefully that they are simply not true statements. That yes, there have been things like that, but it is a misunderstanding, and let me explain exactly what it is. So other than that, you deal with objections later. When an objection comes up, you say, can I come back to this a little bit later? It's a very good point, and I'm going to cover it quite thoroughly in a minute, but it's a little bit out of sequence. Most people will say, okay, sure, come back to it later. Now, the third time to deal with objections is in the presentation. In the presentation, there's 2 ways. You can either bring it up yourself. You can say, Mr. Prospect, at this time, people often ask this question. Sometimes bringing up your own objection and then answering it sounds very professional. In other cases, the customer will say, well, how do you know that? Or what about that? And you know that the objection is coming because that part of the presentation always kicks it up. In which case you say, I'm glad you brought that up, and you go into an answer. And the fourth time that you deal with objections is never. Sometimes people will bring up what we call a smokescreen objection. Well, I don't think we're in the market right now, and it'd be too much trouble to put in. I don't like your colors, and so on. If the objection doesn't come up again in the course of the presentation, don't you bring it up at the end. You know, say, well, hey, remember you said this before? No, don't bring it up at the end. Well, here is one of the most powerful ways of dealing with objections. It's called the preemptive strike. Now, the preemptive strike actually comes from military and politics. The preemptive strike is where you attack and you hit before it actually comes up. And so what you do is you anticipate the objection. If you are accustomed to getting a particular type of objection on a regular basis, you anticipate it. We worked with a company, by the way, a major company, one of the biggest companies in the world, and they said the biggest problem that they had was that people kept complaining about their price, and their prices were the highest in the marketplace, that their competitors had done direct mailing, and their competitors advertised in the paper doing price comparisons to show that this company, my client, was the most expensive in the marketplace. So what would happen? They'd walk in and they'd say, hello, I'm from this company. And they'd say, ha, I know all about you. You guys are the most expensive in the marketplace. I'm not interested. And so they were very discouraged. They were saying their business was shot. Some people were quitting the sales force. Their sales were down. And we taught them how to do a preemptive strike. With a preemptive strike, what they do is they would walk in and they would bring it up first. They would say, before I begin, Mr. Prospect, I want you to know that our company has the most expensive systems of this kind in the marketplace. And you know something? We're proud of it. Because companies like yours buy thousands of our systems every year, even though they know that we're more expensive by something like 15% over our cheapest competitor. Would you like to know why? And almost invariably, the customer would say, yeah, I've heard that. Why do so many companies buy them if they know that you're the most expensive? Mr. Prospect, that's exactly what I'd like to show you, and you can judge for yourself. After that, they couldn't come back later and say, hey, but this is really expensive. You say, yes, I told you it was at the beginning, but it's worth every penny of it. Here's another key to dealing with objections. We call it the most important of all in the inner game of dealing with objections is to treat objections as requests for more information. Treat objections as requests for more information. In other words, when you hear an objection, think of it as a request. Don't think of it as a reason to stop. Say to you in your mind, this is a question, not an objection. And what you do is, number one, what you do is you compliment the objection. Compliment the objection. You say, that's a good question. Remember, people like to be complimented. People like to be complimented on their intelligence. You say, that's a very interesting question. That is a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. In other words, when the person says, I don't like it, I don't want it, I can't use it, I can't afford it, you just turn it around. You say, well, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. Why? How can you afford it? How could you use it? How could you implement it, and so on? Remember, each prospect has what is called key objections. And unless they get those objections out, they won't buy. It's almost as if a prospect has a series of objections like cards. And they're playing cards with you. And the question is whether or not they'll put down all their cards. And your job is to get them to lay their objections down. Now, prospects don't want to get into a big kerfuffle with you, so what they'll do is this, is they will give you a little objection to see how you respond. Do you cry and throw yourself on the floor and have a tantrum? Do you get all upset and angry and defensive? Or do you handle it professionally and low-keyed and positively? Well, if you do, the prospect will feel comfortable giving you another objection. And the customer will give you another objection, and then another, and so on. Your job is to make it easy for the prospect to object. So when the prospect does object, you say, boy, that's very interesting. That's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you very much. Just how do you feel about that? Could you expand on that a little bit? And then here's number 3, is once the person starts giving you the objection, hear it out completely. Even if you've heard it 1,000 times, hear it out 100%. Listen to it as though you've never heard this objection before. Lean forward, practice your listening skills, nod, smile, take notes if you like, and remember this, what is called the 20-80 principle with regard to objections. I made this mistake when I was young and in selling. I'd hear an objection coming, I'd heard that objection before, I was prepared, I knew what the person was going to say, and just as the person got into the objection, I would leap in like a wrestler and I would answer the question. And then I learned this, is that 80% of the important part of an objection is usually contained in the last 20% of the objection. So very often the person would start off objecting in a way or with terms that I'd heard before, but at the last minute they would put a twist on it that made the objection a specific question to their situation, and I'd have raced right past it. So hear the objection out completely. Hear it patiently. Don't assume that you know what they're going to say. Listen closely, nod, smile, be active, and make the person feel comfortable giving you objections so that they'll eventually give you all of their objections and enable you to sell. Here's an important point. If at the end of the sales presentation, the customer still has one objection that they haven't shared with you, and you can't get it out of them, they won't buy. And not only will they not buy, you'll probably never get in to see them again. Your job is to make it very, very easy to object by being open to objections and listening to them carefully and making the person feel good about objecting to you. Well, how do you answer objections? Here's some basic ideas with regard to answering objections. And one thing we know is that you don't argue, you don't fight, you don't get upset. You answer the objections professionally. Here's some words that you can use, and I suggest that you memorize these words. First set of words are the words, obviously you. Obviously you have a good reason for asking that. Do you mind if I ask what it is? Obviously you have a good reason for saying that. Do you mind if I ask what it is? It costs too much. Well, obviously you have a good reason for saying that. Do you mind if I ask what it is? We're not in the market right now. Obviously you have a good reason for saying that. Do you mind if I ask what it is? We get it cheaper from your competitors. Well, obviously you have a good reason for saying that. Do you mind if I ask what it is? This is one of those questions that it is impossible not to answer. When you ask this question, the customer will come back and expand on his or her concerns and try to explain why it is that they have this particular reason. Remember, your job is not to get into an argument or a wrestling match. Your job is to help them uncover the key motivations that may be causing the person to hold back. Here's a second great question. It's one of my favorites. It's how do you mean? Or how do you mean exactly? When a person says, we can't afford it, you say, well, how do you mean? When a person says, we can get it cheaper somewhere else, you say, how do you mean? When a person says, it won't fit our specifications, you say, how do you mean? Or, how do you mean exactly? You can use this question 100 times, and no prospect will even be aware that you've used it. And every single time you ask it, it is another question that is impossible not to answer. It means that when you ask it, the person will take it and expand on their answer. You can then say, how do you mean again? And you can say, well, obviously you have a good reason for saying that. How do you mean? And you can keep going back and forth and take every single objection and let it stretch out. Resist the temptation to answer. Resist the temptation to give them the answer that you know. Remember, if you can help people to expand on an objection, they'll very often answer it themselves. When a person says, well, it costs too much, you say, well, obviously you have a good reason for saying that. Do you mind if I ask what it is? Well, based on our budget and what we were planning to spend and so on. In other words, very often they'll just sort of answer the question themselves. So resist the temptation to answer, because answering an objection often gets you into an argument, which is exactly what you don't want. And here's what's really important, is use objections as opportunities to build trust. Because trust is the critical factor. And how do you build trust? Is you listen attentively. You pause before replying. You lean forward and you nod actively. You feed it back in your own words. You ask questions about it. Use every objection as an opportunity to build trust, and listening builds trust. Even if the person is telling you they don't like your product, your service, your company, or your industry, if you nod and listen and smile and be agreeable and friendly and pleasant, very often, as it says in the Bible, a soft answer turneth away wrath, and you collect more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Well, another key to selling, another key way of handling objections, is what is called the feel, felt, found method. Now, the feel, felt, found method is very simple. When somebody says that they have a problem, they don't like something about what you've told them, you take their argument, which is here, and you turn it around 180 degrees, and you turn it into a conversation, and this is what you say. Person says, it costs too much. You could say, Mr. Prospect, I understand exactly how you feel. Others felt the same way when we first discussed the price with them. But when they began using it, this is what they found. And if you can use an example, what I call a relevant story close, of a person, a specific person, who had the same concerns, this reminds me of Bill Smith. He felt the same way when we explained the price. But once he had put it into operation, this is what he found. And you tell a success story of a person who paid extra and ended up getting far more. For example, I just bought my boys a bicycle. And I bought them a bicycle, a cheap one, before. And someone asked me recently, another father, how much did you pay for your kid's bicycle? And I told him, I said, boy, that's an awful lot of money. I said, yes, it sounds like an awful lot of money, but, and I understand how you feel, but I felt the same way, but this is what I found. When you buy a cheap bicycle, it only lasts for 6 to 9 months. Then it falls apart. Then you have to buy another bicycle, and you're right back to where you started. You can do the same thing. You can say, yes, it does seem like a lot, but once you've paid this once, you don't have to pay it over and over again. Now, where do objections come from? Well, objections come from fuzzy understanding. All objections arise from fuzzy understanding. One of the most important things you do in selling is you take care of fuzzy understanding. If a customer is objecting, it means that they don't understand. In fact, we say that if a sales presentation is perfect, it will end with no objections. But sales presentations are not perfect because people are not perfect. So fuzzy understanding is the primary reason for objections. Your job is to do everything possible to alleviate fuzzy understanding. Where do objections come from? First of all, number one, the problem is not clear to the prospect. Remember, people buy products and services to solve their problems. If the customer is not absolutely clear about what the problem is, then they can't see that your product or service is a solution. Second is they may see that they have a problem, but they don't see that there's a need or an urgency to buy your product or service. It's simply not clear. Your job is to increase the urgency by showing him or her the high cost of not buying. Here's the third. The third reason is that the unique selling proposition of your product is not clear, especially in comparison with your competitors. The prospect doesn't see why he or she should buy your product or service rather than someone else, because you've not made it clear what it is about your product or service that makes it unique, better, different, and superior to that of your competitors. Whenever you find yourself with a customer who's not sure about making a decision, get back to asking questions. Don't try to argue, don't try to talk. Get back to asking questions like, what are you doing now, and how is that working? And begin to open it up. And how much is that costing you? And what is the exact significance of this? What does it mean to you if this situation goes on? And so on. Here are some very interesting types of objections called price objections. And remember, with regard to price objections, price is a very emotional thing. You never get into an argument with people over price. The second point is that you're not looking for to win a price objection argument. You're looking for the reasons behind price objections. Why do people object? Why are they bringing it up? You know that most products or services, 94%, are bought or sold on a non-price basis. In fact, a very good way of dealing with price objections, if you have the courage to do it, is just say this: Mr. Prospect, if you like it, you can afford it, can't you? What's the real reason that you're concerned about buying it? If you like it, you can probably afford it. What's the real reason? But in the absence of using that, here's what you say. When the person says it costs too much, you say, why do you say that? Why do you say that? And just remain completely silent. Tell him why. Have him or her tell you why. Or you can say, Mr. Prospect, why do you feel that way? I can get it cheaper somewhere else. Why do you feel that way? Find out why they feel that they can get it cheaper somewhere else. Don't argue. Don't say, oh, ours is the best price. Just find out why. Or the prospect says, it costs too much, it costs too much, it costs too much. You say, Mr. Prospect, is price your only concern? Is price your only concern? I mean, do you have no other concerns except price? Are you going to buy this solely on the basis of price? Get the prospect to admit that price is only one of many concerns. If the prospect says, oh, price is my only concern, you would say, well, what about delivery? I mean, what if the delivery was late? Well, delivery is important. What about terms? Well, that's important. What about quality and guarantees? Well, what about follow-up service? In other words, Mr. Prospect, price is very important to you, but it's one of several very important concerns. Is that correct? Get the prospect to agree, yes, price is one of my concerns. Here's another question. When they say it costs too much, it's more than I was expecting to pay, you say, how far apart are we? How far apart are we? Mr. Prospect, how far apart are we? If you're selling a $1,000 item and the prospect says, I was only planning to pay $900, that's something. If the prospect says, I was only planning to pay $300, that's something else altogether. Another way of dealing with price is when the person says, how much is it, how much is it, how much is it? You say, wait a second, Mr. Prospect, I know price is important to you. May I come back to that in a moment? Very professional. I know price is important to you. You acknowledge that price is important. You acknowledge that you're not avoiding it. I know price is important to you. May I come back to that in a minute? What happens when you're dealing with a customer with regard to price and they won't let you talk? They say, just tell me how much it is, how much is it, how much is it, how much is it? Well, I have two ways of dealing with this kind of a customer. Many customers are like that on the phone. Many customers are like that in person. They won't even let you go into your presentation before you tell them the price. So what you do is you say this. You say, I don't know. I don't know. I call this caping the price objection. First says, how much is it, how much is it, how much is it? You know what you say? You say, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Mr. Prospect, until I get a chance to ask you a couple of questions, I don't even know if what we have will be of any help to you at all. but if I could ask you a couple of questions, I could give you an answer that's accurate to within $1. Oh, well, that makes sense. But just say you don't know. Let the question go past. Like keeping the bull in the bullfight, just let the question go past. Another way that you can deal with customers who insist on knowing the price before you give a presentation is this. And I used to do this on the phone. When I call up, I say, hello, I'm Brian Tracy. And they say, how much is it? How much is it? How much? I'd say, Mr. Prospect, that's the best part. If it's not exactly right for you, there's no charge. He'd say, what? I say, Mr. Prospect, if it's not exactly right for you, you're not going to buy it, are you? He'd say, well, no, I'm not. And I say, Mr. Prospect, if you don't buy it, then there's no charge. Now, all I need is 10 minutes of your time. I'll show you what I have, and you can decide for yourself. There's always a way to answer an objection with a qualified prospect. The way is very simple. Use the methods that we've talked about, but then answer the objection, provide proof if necessary, ask for confirmation. Does that answer your question, Mr. Prospect? And then proceed with the sales presentation. Remember, objections are the rungs on the ladder to sales success. There are no sales without objections. Your job is to become absolutely excellent in answering any objection that any customer can throw at you.